New book out, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis by Yates Sexton, that is really worth checking out. He also writes on Substack. In fact, I subscribe to his Substack newsletter, Jared Yates, JaredYatesSexton.substack.com, and on Twitter it's JY Sexton. Just by coincidence, the author, Jared Yates Sexton, on the line with us. Jared, welcome back to the program. So tell us about your new book.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a real honor. Huge fan of yours. And, you know, actually, the book is a lot like what you were just reading, the ancient text. There is right now a concentrated attack by the wealthy and the powerful through the Republican Party and through an authoritarian movement that is in the United States and around the world that is attempting to destroy liberal democracy in totality and to create a neo-feudal state. You know, we spend a lot of time now hearing people tell us that the problem was Donald Trump, that somehow or another he perverted conservatism in the Republican Party. But this is what it has been about from the very beginning. It's about restoring hereditary power and also destroying democratic processes, basically as impediments to further empowering and further enriching the powerful and the wealthy.
Yeah, this is not a new narrative. I mean, your book, you go back to the Roman Empire. Aristotle, you know, was engaged in that conspiracy to overthrow the government. He was arguing that democracy was not a good thing. I mean, this was a debate at the founding of our republic. About a third of America wanted to stay with the king. There's always been this sense among humans, typically out of a sense of safety, I'm guessing, that, you know, we need some big, strong person to protect us. And then, of course, you've got, you know, the religious folks who think that wealth is a sign of God's blessing. You know, it's the Calvinists. It's kind of intrinsic to their religion. How deeply embedded is this in human history, and how radical is democracy in that context in your mind?
I mean, democracy is a miracle. I mean, if you really take a look at feudalism, and this was a convergence of all of these powers, right? You had the theological leaders who basically created indoctrination, the idea that you should be subservient to these very special elite classed, you know, monarchs and lords. And if you weren't, of course, that meant that you had no opportunity to go into heaven. Plus, also, in that system, you know, there was no opportunity for advancement, no opportunity for anything to happen. Peasants were kept largely illiterate. The fact that we were able to pull ourselves out of that and fight out of that is a total miracle. And then to fight back with liberalism in totality, I mean, one of the most amazing things that humanity has ever done. But we've taken it for granted. We've believed that we were never going to go back, of course, that we would reach the end of history. And now with the concentration of wealth and capital in just a few hands of a historic quality, the type of which, you know, you were talking about the East India Company, we now have reached this point where liberal democracy, the entire idea, the ideology, the way that we organize the world is in existential crisis. And the people who are funding this and the people who are working towards this goal, they want literally to destroy any representative government and to reinstate these neo-feudal states.
And what's their rationale for that?
Well, there's a lot of ideology behind it, and it goes back to, you know, what you were saying about the perversion of Christianity into this like capitalist Calvinism. The idea is that there are rightful leaders of the world, and you always hear that, whether it's with the Claremont Institute or, you know, some of these wealthy billionaires. The idea is that they have been chosen by the universe because they are the most talented, and democracy gets in their way. Right. And that they are the ones who should be running things, and the democracy leads to mediocrity. And the only reason that democracy exists, and this is, you know, part and parcel of what we're dealing with now, it's a story of conspiracy theories, that democracy is a way for, whether it's Jewish puppet masters, satanic cabals, or just liberal traitors to somehow or another undermine their genius. So what they're trying to do is to reinstate in their minds are the rightful rulers of the world.
Yeah. And what do we do about this?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the fact that, I come from a family of laborers, people who have largely been screwed over, and on top of that, have fallen prey to a lot of these conspiracy theories. But whenever you move away from something like Donald Trump and red versus blue, Democrat versus Republican, and you start talking about top-down power and also exploitation, they start to understand it. And we need to start having a conversation about how wealth doesn't denote talent or competence, but it actually is more of a marker anymore of exploitation. And I think that we need to reignite democratic energy, small d, of course, and also more of a grassroots movement to reform this government and to start fighting back against this authoritarianism.
We've been through these cycles, but we're talking with Jared Yates Sexton. His new book is The Midnight Kingdom, The History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. And I want to get to the coming crisis part too. Throughout our history, we have had these battles before. Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, 1902 took on the oligarchs of his day after, when he became president, when McKinley was shot, and pushed through, ultimately in 1907, pushed through the Tillman Act, which made it a federal crime, which included prison time for corporate CEOs, senior executives, lobbyists, and lawyers if any corporation gave any money or any support of any sort to any politician running for any political office, any federal political office. And, of course, the Supreme Court blew that up in 2010 with Citizens United. But there was a robust discussion about this in the first century of the first decade of the last century. And that produced the 13th Amendment. It produced the income tax. It produced the corporate income tax. It produced the estate tax. What was different then from what's going on now? Was it just the panic, the great panics of 1896, and well, there was a second, smaller one in 1898, or was it, or what was it? How is it that we at times get very populist in a progressive way, and then at times we get very populist in this kind of hardcore right-wing Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan way?
Well, when looking at all this, one of the things that we have to take, a glance at is the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was able to fight those battles, and progressivism was able to win those battles because there were robust progressive people's movements involved in this. People got to the point where they were tired of trust and monopolies running their lives, and they started advocating for change. There was a people's movement behind that, in the same way that there was a people's movement behind the New Deal that eventually, turned, concentrated capital on its head in the 30s and the 40s. And one of the things that we don't like to talk a lot about in our history is that both of these things were opposed vigorously. People like to imagine that FDR was elected and suddenly the New Deal came about. There were concentrated conspiracies against him as the wealthy started giving money to, proto-fascist. They were advocating possibly trying to take over the government. What we see is that whenever these movements start to take place, and I currently think we're in the beginnings of a people's movement. I think that we're starting to see this in labor, and we're starting to see this in, regular people challenging Amazon and Starbucks and Apple. I think whenever those energies arise, you start to see these right-wing authoritarian movements rise up to oppose them. And so as a result, I think we're in the middle of a crisis, but I also think that we need to take a look at this and understand that there is a great opportunity here for something better to come out of this.
I think you're absolutely right. And let me again recommend your Substack newsletter, Dispatches from a Collapsing State. It's over at jaredyatessexton.com, .substack.com. You talk about the coming crisis. It's part of the title of your book. What crisis specifically are you talking about? When is it coming? And, what should we be concerned about? What might we do about it?
Well, we have a collection of crises right now. We have a crisis of confidence. We have a crisis of confidence in leadership. We have economic crises. We have environmental crises. All of these things are starting to come to a head. And for a large part of this is because the neoliberal consensus that redistributed, and I always have to emphasize this, trillions with a T, trillions of dollars from the working and the middle class to the wealthiest 1%. We've now reached a point of historic inequality. In the 80s and 90s, the wealthy flew private jets. We now have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who have private space agencies. That type of inequality almost always leads to a loss of institutional authority and effectiveness. And eventually, when there is a crisis, and there almost always is, those people tend to side with authoritarian energy. ideologies. And as they are challenged, I mean, this is what we're seeing with Elon Musk now. There's a reason why he's moving to the right. These people are always going to protect their own wealth and their own power. And as neoliberalism starts to reach sort of a crisis of its own, as globalism starts to roll back, as global climate change affects all of this, we're going to come to a crossroads. And it's going to look a lot like what the 1930s, 1940s looked like, but also before that, Europe in the post-Napoleon era. Like, these are moments of change, and they are not easy and they are not clean. They are very, very dangerous, but the window is open to make a better world.
And how best do we exploit that?
I think we have to disabuse ourselves of a lot of the notions that neoliberalism has taught us, that we're all in it for ourselves, that we can't trust anyone else, that we're powerless, that we're alone. And the only thing that we can do is vote with our dollars. Which corporation are we going to trust? Which corporation is going to best represent our political ideology? We have to stop looking for saviors and messiahs, and we have to get involved ourselves. We have to remember that democracy is a process we have to be involved with. We have to be on the ground. It's more than going to the voting booth every 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it really well. Do you see? I'm watching the Democratic Party reject. In fact, I just published a book about neoliberalism. The Republican Party is still embracing it. The Democratic Party seems to be moving away rather rapidly, although there's still the kind of Josh Gottheimer faction. Are you seeing the same thing? It seems like we're kind of at the end of an era. We've had this 40-year experiment with Reaganism. It's blown up in our face. We've got about 30 seconds, by the way, before we hit a hard break. I can't stop.
Yeah, no, I think that the right wing is moving toward an authoritarian capitalism, basically to reinforce neoliberalism. And I think the decision that we're going to have to make is, are we going to go back to a New Deal labor-based politics, or are we going to embrace the idea that, white supremacy and patriarchal supremacy are what are going to be the institutions that keep this abreast? But it's a terrible tragedy if we go in that direction. And I think that we have to re-embrace the New Deal consensus.
Yeah, this whole idea of order and classes and whatnot, the old conservative, this goes back thousands of years. Jared Yates Sexton, his new book, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. Also check out his Substack. It's titled Dispatches from a Collapsing State, JaredYatesSexton.substack.com. Jared, thanks a lot for dropping by.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll be right back.